It was a dark and stormy night when a young girl who was in need of a job was able to find work as a babysitter for a couple who lived in a large, isolated old house. They were going out to see a movie that night and left the teenage babysitter in charge of their 2 young children. The babysitter put the children to bed when it got late and then went downstairs to watch some television. She was just getting comfortable when she heard the phone ringing. When she answered it, all she heard was heavy breathing, followed by a man's voice asking, "Have you checked on the children?" Panicked, she hung up the phone, trying to convince herself that it was just someone playing a practical joke. She went back to watching television, but about 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. She picked up the receiver and heard hysterical laughing from the other end of the line. Then, the same voice asked, "Why haven't you checked on the children?" The babysitter slammed down the phone. The poor girl was frightened out of her wits and immediately called the police. The operator at the police station told the babysitter that if the man called again, she should try to keep him talking. That would give the police time to trace the call. A few minutes later, the phone rang a third time, and when the babysitter answered it, she heard the heavy breathing. The voice on the line said, "You should really check on the children." The babysitter listened to him laughing hysterically for a long, long time. Then she hung up the phone again, and almost immediately it rang again. This time, it was the operator from the police station who yelled, "Get out of the house right now! The calls are coming from the upstairs phone." The babysitter dropped the phone in shock, and suddenly she heard heavy footsteps walking down the stairs. Without pausing for a second, she ran out the house as fast as her legs would carry her. Just as she closed the front door behind her, a man's hand slammed against the glass. She screamed and ran out into the street just as the police car was pulling up outside. The police searched the house and found the 2 children upstairs hiding in a closet, crying uncontrollably. In the parents' bedroom, they found a bloody axe lying on the floor next to the upstairs phone. The back window was wide open and the curtains were blowing in the breeze. There was no sign of the madman who had made the phone calls. He had escaped into the night when the police arrived and managed to interrupt his horrible plan to kill the 2 children and the poor babysitter. Terry Heller, in his book The Delights of Terror, discusses several theories as to why fear is necessary. The first theory is survival value, which suggests that hearing and telling scary stories might actually be beneficial to us because we know what situations to avoid in the future. This could explain why children are drawn to scary stories, since they are still developing their understanding of the world. The tendency to be drawn to scary stories, however, can also be observed in adulthood. For this reason, news and entertainment industries that choose to focus on these topics and sensationalize them tend to be very successful.
Did you know that the babysitter story is based on a real event?
Do I ask?
Okay, can you pretend that you don't know? Oh my god.
I really don't.
Why can't you just pretend to be shocked for 5 seconds? Just say,
I'll laugh.
no. Okay.
The story begins, like many urban legends, in that it was a dark and stormy night. Janet Chrisman was a 13-year-old girl who was raped and murdered on March 18, 1950, in the small town of Columbia, Missouri, while babysitting the child of some family friends. At 10:35 p.m. on the night of the murder, Officer McCowan received a phone call in which a girl screamed and told him to come quick. She didn't identify herself, and the test board at the telephone company was understaffed, so the call could not be traced. At 1:35 a.m., the Romax returned home from a party to find the porch light on, the front door unlocked, and Janet lying in a pool of her own blood in the living room. This case is quite well known for being unsolved only because of how poorly it was handled by the police. But here is what we know. A series of rapes of girls roughly her age had occurred within the area over the past few years. At the scene of the crime, there was more evidence of the murderer having been let in willingly than of a break-in occurring. Janet was raped and strangled with a cord cut from a room down the hall, as well as covered in small puncture wounds. The local police had a suspect. His name was Robert Mueller. He was a family friend of the Romacks with intimate knowledge of the layout of the house, and Chrisman also babysat for him. He carried with him a mechanical pencil that fit the puncture wounds found on Janet's body, had made concerning and sexual comments about her body and virginity in the past, and he did not have a solid alibi for the time of the murder. But, because of how the case was handled, he was never caught. I think this is a good segue at this point to talk about something interesting that we learned about the other day, and that is dark tourism. What do you think of dark tourism in general? Because I personally think it's really interesting, and I love going to places where horrible events have happened, and that sounds so weird. I just love it because it's just fascinating and interesting.
No, I'd agree.
But I also find that a lot of times people will be really disrespectful there. Like, I feel like if you want to go there, that's fine, and that's so cool, and I'm down for that. But you have to, like, maintain a certain amount of, like, respecting the dead.
I haven't done a lot of dark tourism because I don't go places, but the places I have been, just sort of like graveyards, and then obviously I love haunted places, and my mother has taken me to places that are supposedly haunted, and it's just a lot of like mainly small town urban legends.
Yeah.
But, so what do you call those? Because they're not urban. I don't know.
Rural legends.
Rural legends. Anyway,
small town legends.
Small town, yeah, legends. And so, like, I always really enjoyed that ever since I was a kid. But I don't know. I guess the Alamo also counts as dark tourism, and I've been there. But
Yeah.
I didn't enjoy that because it was history that I had to pay attention to. But no, I quite enjoy it, like the things that I have done. And I think it's just sort of like the mystery that surrounds it. I can't remember where I heard this. On some podcast I heard this. It was talking about how we have like this will to live, but you also have this like death drive.
Oh,
and
no,
so
I told you about that.
I think you might have told me about that,
Because
but I
I'm
also
taking a class called Death Drive.
Oh, that's true.
It's
Death drive.
Freud's death drive. It's a theory.
Yeah, where you're like that feeling when you're standing on the top of a building, you're like, I could just jump off.
Yeah.
And
it's very, I think it's definitely, like, the fascination with the morbid is definitely a result of that, like, need to live, but also draw towards death.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's sort of like an element of excitement there when you're like so close to something, or you feel like you're close to something strange or like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I'll ask you your opinion. In this case, we have this murder that happened like 50 years ago, 50 plus years ago, but then we have this made-up story that is based on it that most people don't know is from a real event. Do you think that's an exploitation?
That's a tough one. I think that perhaps the closer it was to the actual event, yes, but nowadays the story is so different from the actual events that happened. Like, in the story, the woman hears her phone go off, and she picks it up, and a guy's like, go check on the children, and she's like, what? That's weird. No. And then it happens 2 or 3 more times, and she gets more and more freaked out, and then she calls the police, and the police are there, and they tell her, they were able to trace the call, and they say it's coming from inside the house, and then the girl gets the kids and gets the hell out of there,
So it is pretty far, honestly.
It's very different from the actual story, in which a girl, a 13-year-old girl, is watching a kid, and she puts him to bed, and then she gets raped and strangled and killed. So it's very different. It's not just a stranger inside the house. It was a family friend, and she didn't get out alive. Exploitation, no. Strange that someone found this story and thought it fascinating enough to somehow morph into an urban legend. Yeah. They're not similar, but they are at the same time,
Yeah, I think just the basic elements are similar, but the story is quite different.
Mhm.
So.
And the outcome is surprisingly much
Happier.
happier in the urban legend, which is strange. I feel like a lot of times urban legends try to like teach a lesson that like they try to teach a lesson and the lesson doesn't end well.
Yeah. I don't know. There might have been other versions of the story, though.
Yeah.
And whoever, depending on the person who tells it.
Yeah. And also maybe over time, like the real facts got stripped away just because it did feel too much like they were, you know, using someone's demise for shock factor.
Yeah. Yeah.
20 years seems to be the agreed-upon time in the media to begin making fun of certain moments, but even I'm not sure if that is long enough. I wonder if perhaps it is a case-by-case basis.